The room was dim, tense, and filled with the ghosts of diplomacy. Every delegate in the UN hall had felt it, the rising friction between the West's fading grasp and the iron will of emerging nations. But no one had expected Barack Obama to break his silence. The former U.S. president wasn't scheduled to speak. He wasn't even expected to attend. But there he was, sharp suit, shadowed eyes, stepping into the aisle like a ghost returning to haunt the living. He didn't walk toward the podium. He walked straight toward Captain Ibrahim Traoré. It was as if time slowed, conversations froze, cameras turned, journalists leaned forward. Obama stopped just inches from Traoré, who stood calm in his brown military fatigues, arms crossed, head high. Obama leaned in, lowering his voice so the microphones couldn't hear, but they caught just enough. "Watch your tone," he said, barely above a whisper. A hush fell over the hall. Not because of what was said, but because of who it was said to. Traoré blinked. Once, then twice. A slow smile grew on his face. He tilted his head, stepped slightly forward, and replied, not with a whisper, but with thunder. "Watch your legacy." The words exploded in the hall. Delegates gasped. Some stood. Others ducked their heads. The tension wasn't just political now. It was personal. This was not about diplomacy anymore. This was about history, who wrote it, who erased it, and who would fight to reclaim it. And as Obama quietly retreated to the shadows, it became clear, Traoré didn't come to make friends. He came to make history, and to make the architects of old empires feel the weight of the future. The clash had begun. Obama's words had been meant to intimidate, a final whisper from the so-called adult in the room. But the moment Traoré roared back with, "Watch your legacy," the illusion shattered like glass under a boot. Every diplomat in the chamber felt it. The old guard had just been challenged, not by another Western politician, but by a soldier who carried Africa's fury in his voice. Traoré didn't sit down. He turned slowly toward the entire hall, now dead silent, and spoke into the microphone, not with rage, but with the chilling calm of a man who knew history was on his side. "You've all applauded his legacy. You've written books about his hope and his speeches. But where was that hope when Libya burned? Where were his speeches when African leaders were dragged through the sand? When bombs fell on black soil from Western hands, who was whispering then?" Obama stood in the shadows now, jaw clenched, eyes locked on Traoré. "You want to talk about tone?" Traoré continued. "Let's talk about tone. The tone of drones over Somalia. The tone of silence when France looted Mali. The tone of betrayal when our people begged for justice and received lectures instead." Some delegates shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. Others looked down, ashamed. But many, especially those from the global south, nodded slowly, their expressions hardened with truth. Traoré's voice dropped, but it hit even harder. "You whispered to me, Mr. Obama, but I am not one of your interns. I am not here to be scolded. I am here to remind the world that your smile covered graves." The screen behind him flickered. Images appeared, children in Gaza, blood in Burkina Faso, the ruins of Tripoli, and a map showing oil extraction sites in Africa, all labeled with the flags of Western powers. Traoré turned back to the hall. "Legacy isn't what you say. Legacy is what we bury." No one moved. No one breathed. And somewhere in the shadows, Obama finally looked. Obama had been the icon, the polished face of Western diplomacy. But now, stripped of applause and nostalgia, he stood like a relic in a room that no longer bowed. Traoré didn't just challenge him. He dismantled the myth, piece by piece, with the kind of brutal clarity only truth can deliver. "You called yourself a symbol of hope," Traoré said, his voice unwavering. "But hope for whom? Wall Street? NATO? The men who sharpen knives behind peace treaties?" The room tightened again. "You smiled in Cairo," Traoré continued, pacing now, "told the Arab world they mattered. Then watched Egypt fall into chaos and said nothing. You stood in Johannesburg, quoted Mandela, while AFRICOM expanded across the continent like a spider spinning its web." Obama raised his hand slightly, as if to speak, but Traoré cut him off without even looking at him. "Don't," he said coldly. "You had 8 years. Now it's my turn to speak. Behind Traoré, new footage filled the screen, not propaganda, but facts. Reports of drone strikes in Somalia during Obama's term. CIA involvement in African elections. WikiLeaks cables exposing secret deals with oil companies. Each image was a dagger. You were the first black president, Traoré said, but you let them use your skin as a mask. Behind it, they stole. They killed. They colonized with smiles and signed documents. Obama's face didn't flinch, but his legacy cracked. The worst thing a man can do to his people, Traoré said, his eyes locked on him, is give them hope, then sell it. Silence. Not a murmur, not a cough. Just the echo of a generation watching a god bleed. Traoré stepped back, took a breath, and added, "You taught us how to speak well, Mr. Obama. But now we've learned how to speak truth." Obama stood still, his fingers clasped together in front of him, a practiced pose, presidential yet powerless. For a man who once commanded the global narrative, the silence now surrounding him was heavier than any applause he'd ever received. His expression didn't crack, but his posture betrayed the weight of Traoré's words. Gone was the charm, the rehearsed calm. What remained was a man exposed, not by slander, but by truth. Traoré didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He let the silence stretch like a noose. And then he turned to the assembly. "You all remember his speeches," Traoré said, gesturing to the leaders and diplomats present. "But do you remember his victims?" A screen flickered again behind him, maps of Libya before and after 2011. A country torn open by promises of freedom, left bleeding under skies patrolled by NATO jets. Then a picture, the corpse of Muammar Gaddafi dragged through dirt, surrounded by laughter, filmed on a phone. And above it, Obama's face, from a press conference, the infamous smirk. "We came, we saw, he died," Traoré quoted, voice like a knife. No one laughed this time. "You laughed at a lynching," Traoré growled, his voice deeper now. "The same empire that once lynched your ancestors, you served it. You celebrated for it, you became it." A tremor ran through the room. The European delegation shifted uncomfortably. The African Union delegates sat straighter. The American delegation stared at the table, but Obama, still silent. Traoré walked to the center of the floor, his boots echoing. "This is not about one man," he said. "It's about what happens when one man is raised to the status of a symbol, and then used to shield an empire's crimes." He turned again to Obama, but softer now. "They didn't fear you, Barack. They used you. And now that your image has cracked, they'll discard you. That's the price of becoming their shield." Obama's lips parted, but no words came out. Traoré finished, "If you won't speak truth to power, then power must answer to those who for a moment." The room stood frozen. The old guard, diplomats, strategists, former allies, all stared at Obama, expecting a rebuke, a witty deflection, something. But the former president remained statue still, caught between the pride of his past and the undeniable truth Traoré had just unveiled. Traoré didn't wait for a response. He turned toward the media pit, where journalists whispered furiously into their microphones, their faces lit by phone screens. Every camera was locked on him now. This wasn't just a UN session anymore, it was a reckoning broadcast to the world. "You talk of diplomacy," Traoré said, pacing slowly, "but what do your agreements bring Africa? Debt. What do your partnerships bring us? Surveillance. And what do your so-called humanitarian missions leave behind? Ghost towns, orphans, and charred soil." He paused and pointed directly at the American delegation. Barack Obama was the face of hope, and hope became a mask for conquest. A sharp inhale could be heard from the delegation floor. Traoré wasn't just challenging a man, he was tearing down a myth, brick by brick. "And now," Traoré continued, his voice rising, "that same empire tells me I am dangerous? That I am a destabilizing force? Because I refused their bribes, because I sent their mercenaries home in coffins, because I raised my people to stand, not kneel?" He stopped walking, centered again under the great UN seal, directly across from Obama. "Let's not pretend you're shocked," he said, quietly now. You feared this day would come. Not just you, all of you. The day when Africa would not ask for permission to speak. The day when the lion would no longer whisper. He turned to the assembly one last time. We are not threats, we are mirrors. And if our reflection terrifies you, it is because of the blood on your own hands. Traoré walked back to his seat, never breaking eye contact with Obama. The silence afterward wasn't awkward, it was judgment. Obama lowered his gaze. And somewhere, across the global south, millions who had once hoped in Obama, now stood with Traoré. The silence didn't just linger, it settled. Like ash after a fire. The kind of silence that follows when something sacred has been shattered. And in that stillness, Ibrahim Traoré had done what no African leader had dared on such a stage. He broke the spell of Barack Obama. Obama, usually quick with eloquence, sat still, his expression unreadable. The crowd waited for a clapback, a pivot, a lecture cloaked in charm. None came. Because how do you defend a legacy when someone just dragged it into the light, bloodstains and all? Traoré leaned forward, his voice softer now but even sharper. Let me tell you what legacy means to us. In Mali, it means French mines and American drones. In the Congo, it means child soldiers guarding cobalt for your smartphones. In Gaza, it means silence when bombs fall, and outrage only when the wrong child throws a stone. The camera panned across the room. Some delegates squirmed. Others stared. A few, from Latin America and Asia, nodded quietly. You called yourself the son of Africa, Traoré continued, addressing Obama directly now. But sons protect their mothers. They don't watch as she's carved up and auctioned to the highest bidder. The tension in the air thickened. Obama finally stood, slowly. But before he could speak, Traoré raised a single finger. I'm not done. And for the first time in his post-presidency, Obama, Nobel Peace Prize winner, darling of international diplomacy, sat back down at the command of a younger, darker, unbought voice. Traoré's next words pierced like daggers. You all feared an African who could speak your language. What you never expected, was one who could expose your lies in it. That line echoed. Louder than speeches. Deeper than headlines. It was no longer about Obama. It was about a world built on illusion, and a continent that had just set it on the thunder Traoré unleashed didn't end in that chamber. It rippled outward, across embassies, through newsrooms, into the streets. Social media lit up like a forest fire. The African lion just roared, trended in over 40 countries. Not because he was loud, but because he was undeniable. Back in the assembly, Obama leaned toward the mic, his voice finally breaking the tension. You speak with passion, Ibrahim, he said, carefully. But diplomacy requires restraint. Traoré cut him off. Diplomacy? Was it restraint when you sent drones over Libya? Was it restraint when your silence enabled the Saudi war in Yemen? Was it diplomacy when African economies were forced to kneel beneath World Bank contracts written in your administration's backrooms? The room grew colder. Obama tried to find footing. Leadership isn't about rage. It's about truth, Traoré snapped. And truth is, Mr. President, under your graceful rule, Africa bled quietly so the West could sleep peacefully. But we've woken now. And we don't bleed in silence anymore. Delegates began murmuring, not in dissent, but in awe. Do you know what scares the empire? Traoré asked, stepping forward now. It's not guns. It's not gold. It's a voice from the south, clear, proud, and unshackled. He raised his hand toward the flags behind them, the same flags that had been used to justify colonization, intervention, exploitation. You don't get to define our future anymore. We've reclaimed that right. A long, heavy pause. And then, an unexpected moment, applause. Scattered at first, then growing. From nations long silenced. From those who had waited decades to hear someone say what needed to be said. Traoré didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply stepped back, nodded, and whispered into the mic. Africa didn't ask. Traoré's words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, sharp, lingering, and impossible to ignore. As the room slowly settled, Obama glanced toward the delegation from France, then the UK, then Germany. The old alliances. The old empires. None of them moved. None dared speak. Because in that moment, even they knew, they were not in control of the room anymore. But Traoré wasn't finished. He stepped forward again, slower this time. Not for dramatic effect, but as if dragging the weight of centuries behind him. You called us developing nations, he said, scanning the chamber. You measured our worth in GDPs and export charts, while siphoning our resources and caging our minds with your education systems. You didn't teach us history, you taught us obedience. Obama's expression tightened, the old mask of statesmanship cracking just slightly. But he said nothing. Traoré's voice dropped lower, darker. Let me be clear, he said. Africa isn't poor. Africa isn't weak. Africa is robbed. Every year. Every hour. And you smile, sign trade deals, and call it cooperation. He turned slightly, now addressing the leaders of the World Bank and IMF seated behind their national delegates. Debt is the new gun. Sanctions are the new chains. And your development aid is a leash dressed in velvet. A visible shift ran through the room. Some looked away. Others leaned in, unblinking. You built your empires on our silence, Traoré continued. But that silence is broken. You hear me now, and you will remember this voice, not because it begged, but because it finally said, enough. At that, even some of the press corps, long numb to speeches, began typing with urgency. This wasn't a press conference. It was a rupture. A reckoning. History was no longer being discussed. It was being rewritten, right there on that stage. And as Traoré stood firm beneath the spotlight, with no teleprompter and no rehearsed diplomacy, one thing became clear to every nation watching. Africa had found its voice, and it was no longer asking to be heard. It was demanding to be. A heavy pause fell over the assembly. For the first time in decades, the most powerful nations in the world were not the ones doing the talking, they were the ones being confronted. Not by a G7 leader. Not by a Western diplomat. But by a captain from Burkina Faso, a soldier, not a salesman. Obama leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, as if steadying himself. His voice was quieter this time. Captain Traoré, he said, we all want a better world. But diplomacy requires restraint. Fire makes noise, yes, but it also burns bridges. Traoré turned, his stare unwavering. You speak of bridges, Mr. Obama. But bridges built on the backs of slaves and miners and child laborers are not bridges, they are tombs. A murmur ran through the room. Some leaders shuffled in their seats. A few visibly tensed. Traoré's words weren't simply challenging policy, they were indicting an entire legacy. He walked toward the central aisle, slowly. You came to Africa with cameras and smiles. You called it outreach. But we remember the weapons you left behind. The puppet governments you installed. The silence when our people bled. He pointed subtly toward the American delegation. You speak of unity, but only when we obey. You praise democracy, until it delivers someone you can't control. That's not diplomacy. That's domination with better branding. Even Obama, master of calm, seemed momentarily rattled. But Traoré didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The power wasn't in the volume of his voice, but in the truth no one could deny. Why are your embassies fortified like bunkers across Africa? Traoré asked the room. Why does your aid always come with troops? Why do your corporations find gold and oil, but our people still find hunger? No one answered. Because they knew. They had always known. Traoré turned once more to Obama. You ask me to watch my tone. I say, watch your legacy. Because when the final chapter is written, history won't ask who smiled at the summits. It will ask who stood when silence was demanded. And I am standing. The room stayed silent. But outside, across Africa, a generation stood with the air in the UN chamber felt heavier now, not with fear, but with reckoning. What had begun as another carefully choreographed summit had unraveled into something real, something raw. And at the center of it stood Ibrahim Traoré, unshaken. Obama remained seated, his jaw tight, his hands laced together. For the first time in his career, perhaps, he had no rehearsed answer. No elegant deflection. Just a silence that screamed louder than any denial. From the back rows, a representative from the global south slowly rose. Then another. And another. Leaders from Mali, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Chad. Even voices that had long been sidelined now stood, not for applause, but for solidarity. Traoré glanced at them with a quiet nod, then turned back to the hall. You have called us unstable, dangerous, unpredictable, he said. But you forget, your wars made our chaos. Your greed mined our peace. You made the fire, then blamed us for the smoke. His tone was steady, every word precise. You ask why I speak so boldly? Because I buried the children your drones never apologized for. I held the mothers who cried over collateral damage. I've seen your peacekeeping with rifles, your investments with chains. He stepped forward. If truth is dangerous, then I am its weapon. And I will not sheath it for your comfort. Then, turning toward the global press corps, cameras clicking and recording. To the people watching this, in Harlem, in Bamako, in Gaza, in Port-au-Prince, know this, we are not voiceless. We were silenced. But that time is over. The hall was frozen. Even those who disagreed with him couldn't look away. Something irreversible had just happened. The illusion of Western moral authority had cracked, not with violence, but with defiance. And as Traoré left the podium, the silence finally broke. Not with applause from diplomats. But with chants outside the building. Thousands had gathered in the streets. Chanting not for America, not for empires, but for one man who dared to say, we are not afraid anymore. And the world heard it.